My name is Haley Morrison, and I'm 31 years old. I'm standing in my empty $950,000 house, keys in one hand, signed papers in the other. The buyers just left, and I should feel sad about losing my dream home, but all I feel is this strange sense of freedom. 3 months ago, my father called me a burden after my mother's funeral, and I stayed silent. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't fight back. I just listened to those words echo in my mind until they became my motivation. He wanted me gone from his life? Fine. But he had no idea what he just lost. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever felt undervalued by your own family, hit that like button because this story is for you. Subscribe for more real-life stories, and let's get into how one cruel sentence changed everything and led to the most empowering decision of my life. Growing up in the Morrison household looked perfect from the outside. My father Richard was a successful insurance broker who drove expensive cars and wore tailored suits every day to his downtown office. My mother Linda was the kind of woman who baked cookies for school events and remembered every single birthday of every single neighbor. But behind our pristine suburban facade lived a family dynamic that would shape every relationship I'd ever have. Richard had his golden child, my older brother Derek, who was 33 and could apparently do no wrong in our father's eyes. Every soccer goal Derek scored was celebrated like he'd won the World Cup. Every mediocre grade he brought home was praised as if he'd discovered the cure for cancer. Meanwhile, I existed in Derek's shadow, collecting scraps of attention whenever my father remembered he had a daughter. The pattern started early. When Derek failed his driving test twice at 16, Dad bought him extra lessons and a brand new Honda Civic to practice in. When I aced my SATs 2 years later, Dad grunted approval and went back to reading his newspaper. Derek dropped out of college after 1 semester to pursue his band dream, and Dad called him an artist following his passion. I graduated summa cum laude with a business degree, and Dad asked why I hadn't chosen something more practical like nursing. Every achievement I earned felt like it disappeared into a void of indifference, while Derek's failures were reframed as learning experiences and character-building moments. Mom Linda became my sanctuary in that house of emotional neglect. She'd slip into my room after Dad went to bed, bringing hot chocolate and asking about my day with genuine interest. She celebrated my academic achievements with private dinners at our favorite restaurant, just the two of us, where she'd tell me how proud she was and how much potential I had. Linda taught me that love wasn't supposed to be conditional or competitive, but her gentle presence couldn't completely shield me from the constant message that I simply wasn't valuable enough to capture my father's attention. The irony wasn't lost on me that the parent who saw my worth was the one who hadn't passed down the family name. By 18, I'd learned to expect nothing from Richard and everything from myself. I put myself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs, bought my first car with money I'd saved from working retail, and moved into my own apartment the day after graduation. Derek, meanwhile, bounced between failed ventures and couch surfing, always landing back in his childhood bedroom when reality hit too hard. Dad would welcome him home with open arms every single time, muttering about how tough the economy was for creative types. When I bought my first house at 28, a beautiful 3-bedroom colonial that I'd saved every penny to afford, Dad's only comment was that the neighborhood looked expensive. Derek was 31, unemployed, and living in our childhood basement, but somehow I was the one making questionable financial decisions. The dynamic reached its breaking point when Mom got sick. Lung cancer, stage 4, diagnosed on a random Tuesday that split my life into before and after. Derek visited twice during her 8-month battle, both times asking if she needed anything while simultaneously hinting that he could really use some cash for rent. Dad hired a full-time caregiver and continued going to work every day like nothing had changed, leaving me to coordinate doctor appointments, manage medications, and sit beside Mom's hospital bed during the endless chemo sessions that made her so weak she could barely lift her head. I took leave from my consulting job, spent my savings on experimental treatments, and held her hand through every procedure while Dad attended his weekly golf games and Derek pursued his latest get-rich-quick scheme. Linda Morrison died on a Sunday morning in October, and I was the only person in that room when she took her final breath. She squeezed my hand and whispered that I was the best thing she'd ever done, that I was stronger than I knew, and that I should never let anyone make me feel small. Dad arrived an hour later from his morning jog, looked at her peaceful face, and immediately started making phone calls about funeral arrangements. Derek showed up that evening smelling like alcohol and asking if Mom had left a will. As I sat there watching these two men treat my mother's death like a business transaction, something inside me finally understood that I'd never belonged in this family the way I'd desperately wanted to. The funeral was everything Mom would have wanted, elegant and warm and full of people sharing stories about her kindness. I arranged every detail myself, from the flower arrangements that matched her favorite garden blooms to the reception menu featuring all the recipes she'd been famous for in our neighborhood. I paid for everything without asking for help, partly because I knew Derek was broke and partly because I wanted to honor Mom properly without anyone's financial limitations affecting the service. Dad stood beside me during the receiving line, shaking hands and accepting condolences like the grieving widower he appeared to be, but I noticed he kept checking his phone and seemed more concerned with networking than mourning. Derek disappeared immediately after the cemetery service, claiming he needed space to process his grief, which apparently involved spending the next 3 days at various bars around town. Dad went through the motions of sorting through Mom's belongings, but I could tell his heart wasn't in it. He kept items that had monetary value and donated everything else with the efficiency of someone cleaning out a storage unit rather than preserving memories of a 40-year marriage. The house felt different without Mom's presence, colder and more hollow, like someone had turned down the volume on everything that used to feel like home. 1 month after we buried my mother, I decided to visit Dad because I was struggling with grief and desperately needed some kind of connection to family. I thought maybe we could comfort each other, maybe finally build the relationship that had eluded us for 31 years. I brought groceries and planned to cook dinner, hoping we could share stories about Mom and start healing together. Instead, I walked into our family kitchen and found my father sitting across from a woman I'd never seen before, their hands intertwined on the table where Mom used to serve Sunday dinners. Her name was Brenda Walsh, and she was 45 years old with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive handbag that probably cost more than most people's rent. She'd been widowed 3 years earlier, she explained with practiced sympathy, and she understood exactly what Dad was going through during this difficult time. The way she spoke about grief sounded rehearsed, like she'd given this speech before, and there was something calculating in her eyes when she looked around our house. She complimented the crown molding and mentioned how spacious the rooms were, making observations that felt more like appraisals than casual comments. Dad seemed different around Brenda, more animated than I'd seen him since before Mom's diagnosis, but also somehow smaller. He hung on her every word and kept asking if she needed anything, displaying a level of attentiveness I'd never witnessed him show toward Mom or anyone else in our family. When I asked if we could speak privately, Brenda immediately suggested she should leave to give us family time, but Dad insisted she stay because she was helping him navigate his grief journey. The subtext was clear: this stranger's comfort mattered more than his daughter's need for connection. Our conversation started civilly enough, with me trying to understand how Dad was processing Mom's death and whether he was taking care of himself. But Brenda kept interjecting with comments about moving forward and not dwelling on the past, speaking about my mother like she was an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to mourn. When I mentioned that I was still struggling with the loss and hoped we could support each other, Brenda exchanged a look with Dad and suggested that some people process grief by clinging to others in unhealthy ways. Dad nodded along like this assessment made perfect sense. The explosion happened when I asked Dad if he thought it was too soon to be introducing new people into his life while Mom's perfume still lingered in their bedroom closet. Brenda's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something sharp and predatory underneath her sympathetic exterior, before Dad stepped in to defend her honor. He told me I had no right to judge his choices, that Mom was gone and life had to continue, and that I needed to stop being so clingy and needy now that I didn't have her to enable my emotional dependence. His words felt like physical blows, but the worst was yet to come. "You're nothing but a burden," Dad said with more conviction than I'd ever heard him express about anything involving me. I'm done supporting your neediness. Your mother spoiled you into thinking you deserved constant attention, but that's over now. Brenda's helping me see how toxic this family dynamic has become, and I'm not going to let you drag me down with your emotional manipulation." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that would never stop burning. I looked at this man who'd never once told me he loved me, never once celebrated my achievements, never once made me feel valued, and realized he'd finally found the courage to say what he'd always thought about his daughter. I didn't cry or scream or defend myself. I just stood there absorbing the full weight of his rejection while Brenda watched with something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Then I picked up my purse, walked to the front door, and left without saying another word. Derek called me 3 hours later after Dad apparently told him about our conversation. Instead of offering support or expressing shock at our father's cruelty, Derek took Dad's side and suggested I was being too dramatic about the whole situation. Family loyalty, it seemed, only flowed in one direction in the Morrison household, and it definitely didn't include me. After that devastating conversation with Dad, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of wallowing in rejection or trying to fix relationships that had always been broken, I channeled every ounce of pain into building something they could never take away from me. I threw myself into work with the intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose, and it turned out that emotional devastation was excellent fuel for professional achievement. My consulting business had been steadily growing since I'd started it 3 years earlier, but now it became my entire universe. I specialized in helping struggling businesses identify their inefficiencies and develop strategies for sustainable growth, and apparently my own life experience with dysfunction made me exceptionally good at diagnosing other people's problems. Within 6 months of cutting contact with my family, I doubled my client base and tripled my rates. Companies started seeking me out specifically because I had a reputation for delivering results that other consultants couldn't achieve. My phone rang constantly with new opportunities, and I said yes to everything because work was the only thing that made me feel valuable. That's when I met Jennifer Walsh, a 60-year-old entrepreneur who'd built and sold 3 successful companies before age 50. Jennifer became my mentor, teaching me lessons about business and life that went far beyond profit margins and market analysis. She'd grown up poor with parents who told her she'd never amount to anything, and she understood the unique motivation that comes from having to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. Jennifer taught me that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't confrontation or drama, but building a life so successful they can't ignore it. Under Jennifer's guidance, I learned to think strategically about everything, especially money. She showed me how to diversify my income streams, invest in appreciating assets, and build wealth that could provide security and freedom rather than just comfort. I started buying rental properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods, investing in index funds and tech stocks, and even putting a small percentage into cryptocurrency when Jennifer explained the potential for exponential growth. Every dollar I earned became a building block toward complete financial independence. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 years, my net worth had grown from about $200,000 to nearly $1 million. My consulting business was bringing in more money than I could have imagined possible, and my investments were performing better than I'd dared to hope. I'd gone from being the family disappointment to being wealthier than Dad had ever been, and the irony wasn't lost on me that his rejection had been the catalyst for achievements he'd never thought I was capable of. During this period of explosive growth, I met Noah Stevens at a business networking event where I was speaking about strategic planning for small businesses. Noah was 34, owned a successful architecture firm, and had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are without needing external validation. He asked intelligent questions during my presentation and approached me afterward with genuine interest in my methodologies rather than the usual networking small talk about leveraging synergies and maximizing opportunities. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the desperate need for validation that had characterized my previous dating experiences. Noah had grown up in a loving family where achievements were celebrated and failures were treated as learning opportunities, and he couldn't quite understand why I never mentioned my father or brother. When I finally told him about my family dynamics, He was horrified by their treatment of me and amazed by my resilience in building such a successful life despite their lack of support. Noah became my safe harbor during this period of intense growth and change. He celebrated my business victories, supported me through the occasional setbacks, and never made me feel like my success threatened his masculinity or overshadowed his own achievements. For the first time in my life, I was in a relationship where I felt truly valued for who I was rather than criticized for who I wasn't. We bought a house together, a stunning 4-bedroom contemporary with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen that would have made Mom proud, and I finally understood what it felt like to build a home with someone who chose to love me. The radio silence from my family was both painful and liberating. Dad never called to check on me or ask how I was handling Mom's death. Derek only reached out when he needed money, sending occasional text messages asking for loans that he had no intention of repaying. Their absence from my life confirmed everything I'd always suspected about my value to them, but it also freed me to discover who I could become without their constant disapproval weighing me down. For the first time in 3 decades, I was living entirely for myself, and it turned out I was much more capable than anyone in my family had ever imagined. 2 years of blissful silence ended with a phone call that came at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in March. Derek's name appeared on my phone screen, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail like I had with all his previous attempts at contact. Something made me answer though, maybe curiosity about what financial emergency had finally driven him to actual conversation rather than his usual begging text messages. His voice sounded different than I remembered, smaller somehow and definitely desperate. "Haley, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I'm in serious trouble and I need help." Derek had never been good at asking for things directly, usually preferring to hint around his problems until someone offered assistance, but this call was different. He sounded scared in a way I'd never heard before, like someone who'd finally realized that his safety net had disappeared. "I owe some people money, serious money, and they're not the type to accept payment plans or excuses. I'm talking about $80,000 to guys who collect debts with baseball bats." The story came out in fragments between his obvious panic and my incredulous questions. Derek had discovered online gambling during the pandemic lockdowns, starting with small bets on sports games and gradually escalating to high-stakes poker and blackjack. What began as entertainment during boring evenings had become an addiction that consumed his unemployment benefits, his credit cards, and eventually money borrowed from loan sharks who operated outside the legal banking system. He'd been living in Dad's basement while accumulating debt that could literally get him killed if he didn't pay up soon. But the truly shocking revelation wasn't Derek's gambling problem, it was what had happened to our father during the 2 years I'd been building my new life. Brenda hadn't just moved into Dad's house, she'd systematically taken control of every aspect of his existence. She'd convinced him to add her name to his bank accounts for convenience, transfer ownership of the house to protect it from potential lawsuits, and give her power of attorney to handle his business affairs while he focused on healing from his grief. Dad had willingly handed over control of assets he'd spent 40 years accumulating. "She's got everything, Haley," Derek continued, his voice cracking with something that might have been genuine emotion. "The house, the bank accounts, even his retirement funds. Dad doesn't even have access to his own money anymore without her permission. She controls what he eats, where he goes, who he talks to. It's like she's turned him into some kind of prisoner in his own life." Derek had finally witnessed the manipulation I'd recognized immediately, but his awakening had come too late to protect our father from the consequences of his choices. The most infuriating part of Derek's call wasn't his request for money, it was his assumption that family loyalty should override everything that had happened between us. "You're my sister," he pleaded, using emotional manipulation tactics he'd learned from watching Dad. "Family helps family, right? I know things got ugly after Mom died, but we need to stick together now. I'll pay you back, I swear. I just need enough to get these guys off my back, and then I can figure out how to help Dad get away from Brenda." My response was colder than the March morning air seeping through my kitchen windows. "Ask Dad for help," I said with deliberate calm. "Oh wait, that's right, you can't because he doesn't have access to his own money anymore. Maybe you should have thought about family loyalty when he called me a burden and you backed him up. Maybe you should have considered sticking together when I was grieving mom alone while you were getting drunk and he was playing house with his new girlfriend. Derek tried to interrupt with protests about how he'd been processing grief in his own way and how he'd never really agreed with Dad's harsh words, but I wasn't interested in revisiting history or accepting retroactive apologies. He'd had 2 years to reach out, 2 years to acknowledge what had happened, 2 years to show that he cared about maintaining a relationship with his sister. Instead, he'd waited until he needed something before remembering I existed. I'm not bailing you out of this mess, I continued, surprised by how calm I felt while delivering such a definitive rejection. I'm not rescuing Dad from the consequences of his choices either. You both made it clear that I'm not really part of this family, so don't expect me to act like one now that it's convenient for you. Derek's desperate protests faded into background noise as I hung up the phone and went back to making my morning coffee. But even as I maintained my resolve about not getting financially involved in Derek's crisis, something he'd said about Brenda's behavior patterns nagged at me throughout the day. The systematic way she'd gained control over Dad's assets, the isolation from family members, the gradual assumption of power over his daily decisions, it all sounded like something I'd read about in articles about elder abuse and financial exploitation. Dad might have been cruel to me, but he didn't deserve to be manipulated and robbed by someone pretending to love him. The question was whether I cared enough about his welfare to get involved in a situation that would definitely bring drama back into my carefully constructed peaceful life. Something about Derek's description of Brenda's systematic control over Dad's life troubled me throughout the week following his desperate phone call. I'd worked with enough businesses to recognize the signs of a hostile takeover, and what he'd described sounded less like a grieving widower finding new love and more like a calculated acquisition strategy. Jennifer had always taught me to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, so I decided to do some research into Brenda Walsh's background. I need you to run a comprehensive background check on someone, I told Jennifer during our monthly mentoring lunch at her favorite downtown restaurant. I'm not sure what I'm looking for exactly, but there's something about this woman that doesn't add up. Jennifer had connections throughout the business community and access to resources that could uncover information ordinary people couldn't access. More importantly, she understood the difference between healthy curiosity and paranoid suspicion. The results came back 3 weeks later, and they were worse than anything I'd imagined. Brenda Walsh had a pattern of targeting recently widowed men with substantial assets, gaining their trust during vulnerable periods, and systematically transferring their wealth to accounts she controlled. Her first husband had died in a car accident in Ohio, leaving her a house and $200,000 in life insurance. Within a year of his death, she'd moved to Michigan and married a retired teacher named Robert Chen who'd lost his wife to cancer. Robert's adult children had tried to warn him about Brenda's suspicious behavior, but he'd been so grateful for her attention and companionship that he'd refused to listen to their concerns. Over the course of their 2-year marriage, Brenda had convinced Robert to sell his family home, liquidate his retirement accounts, and invest everything in a business venture that existed only on paper. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, the children discovered that Brenda had disappeared along with every penny of their father's estate. The pattern had repeated itself in Pennsylvania with a widowed dentist named Frank Morrison, no relation to our family despite sharing the surname. Frank's sister had filed a police report alleging financial elder abuse, but Brenda had covered her tracks too well and left the state before any charges could be filed. Each time, she'd used a slightly different version of her story, adjusted her appearance with different hair colors and styles, and moved to a new region where no one knew her history. But the most shocking discovery was that Brenda hadn't just stumbled across my father by accident. Jennifer's investigator had found evidence that she'd been researching recently widowed men in our area through obituary notices and public records. She'd specifically targeted men over 60 with valuable assets and no close family ties to interfere with her plans. Dad had been perfect for her purposes, lonely, grieving, financially comfortable, and estranged from his children who might have questioned her motives. She's not just a gold digger, Jennifer explained as we reviewed the investigator's report. She's a professional con artist who specializes in exploiting grieving men. The fact that your father pushed you away after your mother's death made him an even more attractive target because she didn't have to worry about family members interfering with her plans. The realization that my father's cruelty toward me had made him vulnerable to exploitation added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Derek called again 2 days after I received the background check results, this time with even more disturbing news about what was happening in Dad's house. Brenda had convinced Dad to marry her in a small ceremony at the courthouse, telling him that marriage would provide legal protections for both of them and simplify their financial arrangements. What she hadn't mentioned was that marriage also gave her automatic inheritance rights and made it much harder for anyone to challenge her control over his assets. "She's got him completely isolated now," Derek reported during our tense phone conversation. "He can't make any decisions without her approval, can't access money without her permission, can't even visit friends without her supervision. When I try to talk to him about what's happening, she's always right there controlling the conversation and making him feel guilty for doubting her motives." Derek had finally recognized the manipulation tactics that I'd spotted immediately, but his awakening had come too late to prevent the marriage that gave Brenda legal access to everything Dad owned. The worst part was that Brenda had already started the final phase of her plan. Derek had overheard her talking to a real estate agent about listing Dad's house for sale, claiming they wanted to downsize to a retirement community in Florida where they could enjoy their golden years together. Of course, there was no retirement community and no shared future. Once the house sale was complete and the proceeds were safely transferred to accounts Brenda controlled, she would disappear just like she had with her previous victims. "I know I messed up," Derek continued, his voice heavy with regret that felt genuine for the first time in our adult relationship. "I know I should have supported you when Dad said those awful things, and I know I should have seen what Brenda was doing from the beginning. But he's still our father, and I can't just watch her destroy him even if he brought it on himself." For the first time in my memory, Derek was asking for help rather than demanding it, and acknowledging his own failures rather than blaming others for his problems. Noah found me that evening sitting in our kitchen with the background check report spread across the table, staring at the evidence of Brenda's systematic destruction of vulnerable men's lives. "You're going to get involved, aren't you?" he asked gently, settling into the chair beside me and taking my hand. He'd been listening to my updates about the family drama with the patience of someone who understood that past wounds don't heal just because you ignore them. "I can't let her rob him blind," I admitted, surprised by the emotions swirling through my chest. "He was terrible to me, but he doesn't deserve this. And if I don't do something to stop her, she'll move on to the next lonely widower and destroy his life too." Noah nodded with the kind of understanding that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him. He didn't try to talk me out of getting involved or point out that my father had made his own choices. He just squeezed my hand and asked how he could help me protect someone who'd never protected me. Armed with evidence of Brenda's criminal pattern, I hired Marcus Thompson, a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases and had experience working with law enforcement agencies. Marcus was a former police detective who'd transitioned to private practice after 20 years of investigating white-collar crimes, and he understood exactly what type of evidence would be needed to build a case against someone as careful and experienced as Brenda Walsh. "She's good at what she does," Marcus explained during our initial consultation in his downtown office. "The fact that she's never been successfully prosecuted despite multiple victims means she knows how to stay just inside the legal boundaries while morally and financially destroying people. But everyone makes mistakes eventually, and the more confident they become, the sloppier they get." Marcus had already started surveillance on Brenda's activities and was documenting every meeting with real estate agents, every bank transaction, and every conversation that might reveal her true intentions. The urgency of the situation became clear when Marcus discovered that Brenda had already scheduled a meeting with a realtor for the following week. Dad's house was worth approximately $400,000, and the plan was to list it as a quick sale to generate immediate cash rather than waiting for the best possible price. Combined with Dad's savings accounts, retirement funds, and other investments that were now under Brenda's control, she stood to walk away with nearly $600,000. My first instinct was to approach the situation through legal channels, but Marcus explained that pursuing criminal charges would take months or years while Brenda completed her theft and disappeared. By the time we build a case that prosecutors are willing to take to court, your father will be broke and alone in some nursing home while Brenda is living under a new identity in another state, he warned. If you want to stop her, you need to confront this situation directly and quickly. The decision to approach Dad directly was one of the hardest I'd ever made. I hadn't spoken to him since that devastating conversation 3 years earlier when he'd called me a burden and chosen Brenda's side over his own daughter's concerns. The thought of walking back into that house where Mom had died and Brenda now reigned supreme filled me with anxiety and anger in equal measure. But Marcus was right, that time was running out, and Derek's increasingly panicked phone calls confirmed that Dad was completely under Brenda's influence. I arrived at the family home on a Saturday afternoon in April, driving the luxury sedan that represented everything I'd achieved since our last conversation. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, but I knew that Mom's presence had been erased from every room and replaced with Brenda's calculated domesticity. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes, gathering courage and reviewing the talking points I'd prepared for this confrontation. Dad answered the door looking older and smaller than I remembered, wearing clothes that looked expensive but somehow didn't fit his personality. His hair was perfectly styled in a way that reminded me more of Brenda's aesthetic preferences than his own usual casual appearance. "Haley," he said with surprise that seemed genuine, "what are you doing here?" There was no warmth in his greeting, but there was also no immediate hostility, which felt like progress compared to our last interaction. "I need to talk to you about Brenda," I said directly, deciding that subtle approaches wouldn't work with someone who'd already been thoroughly manipulated. "I have information about her background that you need to see before you make any major financial decisions." Dad's expression immediately shifted to defensive mode, and I could see him preparing to protect the woman who'd become his entire world since Mom's death. "Brenda has been nothing but supportive during the most difficult period of my life," Dad replied with the kind of rehearsed conviction that suggested he'd had this conversation before. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I'm not interested in listening to jealous accusations from someone who abandoned her family when we needed her most." The irony of being accused of abandonment by the man who'd literally told me I was a burden wasn't lost on me, but I forced myself to stay focused on the evidence rather than relitigating old grievances. Before I could respond, Brenda appeared behind Dad in the hallway, wearing a perfectly coordinated outfit and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Haley, what a lovely surprise," she said with false warmth that made my skin crawl. "Richard was just telling me how much he missed having family around. It's wonderful that you've decided to reconnect during such a happy time in our lives." She moved to Dad's side with practiced ease, taking his arm in a gesture that looked supportive but felt possessive. "I'm here because I've discovered some disturbing information about your background," I said directly to Brenda, watching her face for any sign of recognition or concern. "You've been married before to other widowed men, and there's a pattern of financial manipulation and theft that ends with them losing everything they've worked for." Brenda's expression never changed, but I noticed her grip tighten slightly on Dad's arm. "That's a very serious accusation to make without evidence," Brenda replied smoothly, her voice taking on a hurt tone that was clearly designed to elicit protective feelings from Dad. "I can't imagine why someone would want to spread such vicious lies about a relationship that's brought so much joy and healing to your father's life. Perhaps this is really about your own feelings of guilt for staying away during his time of need." Dad stepped forward protectively, his face flushing with anger that was now directed entirely at me. "How dare you come into my house and attack the woman who's helped me rebuild my life," he said with more passion than I'd ever heard him express about anything involving family. "Brenda has been nothing but kind and loving, and I won't stand here and listen to you tear her down because you're jealous of our happiness." The confrontation escalated quickly from there, with Dad defending Brenda's honor while she stood behind him looking wounded and vulnerable. Every piece of evidence I tried to present was dismissed as fabrication or misunderstanding, and every attempt to explain the pattern of exploitation was reframed as my inability to accept his new relationship. Within 30 minutes, I found myself being asked to leave the house where I'd grown up, with Dad warning me never to return with such disrespectful behavior. As I walked back to my car, I heard Brenda's voice through the open front door, comforting Dad and reassuring him that he'd done the right thing by standing up to my emotional manipulation. She was good at what she did, I had to admit, turning every confrontation into evidence of her victimhood and his strength. But I'd accomplished one important goal. I'd put her on notice that someone was watching and investigating her activities. The question now was whether that would be enough to stop her or simply make her accelerate her timeline for completing the theft. Derek had witnessed the entire confrontation from his position in the basement, and he called me before I'd even made it home. "I saw everything," he said quietly, his voice heavy with a resignation I'd never heard before. "She's got him completely convinced that you're the enemy and she's his savior. But I also saw the look on her face when you mentioned her background. She's scared now, and scared people make desperate decisions." For the first time since this crisis began, Derek and I were on the same side, united by our shared concern for Dad's welfare despite his rejection of our help. The confrontation with Dad and Brenda had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped it would, even though the immediate results looked like complete failure. Marcus's continued surveillance revealed that my accusations had rattled Brenda enough to make her careless, and she'd started making phone calls and taking meetings that provided exactly the evidence we needed to build a case against her. Within a week of my visit, she'd contacted 3 different real estate agents about expediting the house sale and had made inquiries about transferring large amounts of money to offshore accounts. "She's panicking," Marcus reported during our emergency meeting at his office. "Your confrontation made her realize that someone is investigating her background, so she's trying to complete the theft and disappear before anyone can stop her. The good news is that panic makes people sloppy, and she's left us a trail of evidence that proves criminal intent." Marcus had recordings of Brenda discussing the sale timeline with real estate agents, photos of her meeting with financial advisors about international money transfers, and documentation of bank transactions that violated the fiduciary duties of someone with power of attorney. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Derek had been secretly recording conversations in Dad's house using his phone, initially just to document Brenda's manipulation tactics for his own protection. What he'd captured instead was Brenda on a phone call with someone she called her business partner, discussing the Morrison case like it was just another con job they were pulling together. She'd described Dad as completely under control and estimated that they'd be able to extract at least $500,000 before anyone figured out what was happening. "Listen to this," Derek said as he played the recording for me in my car outside Marcus's office. Brenda's voice was clear and calculating as she discussed the timeline for completing what she called the Morrison acquisition. She mentioned previous successful operations in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, providing confirmation of everything Jennifer's background check had revealed about her criminal history. Most importantly, she discussed plans to have Dad sign additional financial documents that would give her irrevocable access to his retirement accounts. The recording also revealed that Brenda wasn't working alone. Her business partner was someone named Carl Stevens who specialized in creating false identities and laundering money through legitimate business investments. Carl had already established new accounts in the Cayman Islands where the Morrison assets would be transferred once the house sale was completed. They'd done this operation multiple times before with other victims, perfecting their methods and building a network of resources that made them nearly impossible to trace once they disappeared. While we were gathering evidence against Brenda, Derek was dealing with his own escalating crisis. The loan sharks he owed money to had started making more aggressive collection attempts, showing up at Dad's house and making threats that terrified everyone in the neighborhood. Brenda used these incidents to further isolate Dad from Derek, claiming that his gambling debts were putting everyone in danger and that the family needed to distance themselves from such irresponsible behavior. "She's using my problems against me," Derek explained during one of our increasingly frequent strategy meetings. "Every time those guys show up looking for money, she tells Dad that I'm bringing criminal elements into their peaceful life. She's even suggested that he should get a restraining order against me to protect himself and their marriage." Brenda had found the perfect way to eliminate Derek as a potential obstacle while simultaneously making Dad feel like he needed her protection even more desperately. The situation reached a breaking point when Brenda convinced Dad to file that restraining order, claiming that Derek's presence in the house was endangering their safety and preventing Dad from healing properly. The legal document prohibited Derek from coming within 500 feet of the property where he'd been living, effectively making him homeless while also cutting off his access to any evidence of Brenda's criminal activities. But Brenda had made a critical error in pushing Derek out of the house so aggressively. In her eagerness to eliminate him as a witness to her activities, she'd created an enemy with nothing left to lose and intimate knowledge of her daily routines. Derek might have been a gambling addict with poor judgment, but he wasn't stupid, and he'd spent enough time observing Brenda's behavior to understand exactly how dangerous she was to our father. "I found something while I was packing my stuff," Derek told me during an urgent phone call on the day he was forced to move out. "She's been stealing cash from Dad's safe, small amounts that he probably doesn't even notice are missing. I took pictures of the safe before and after she accessed it, and there's at least $30,000 missing." This evidence of ongoing theft provided exactly what Marcus needed to involve law enforcement in a way that would have immediate consequences rather than waiting months for a complex financial fraud case to work its way through the courts. The perfect storm was completed when Brenda overplayed her hand by filing a restraining order against me as well, claiming that my threatening behavior during the confrontation at Dad's house had made her fear for her safety. The legal filing was clearly designed to prevent me from interfering with her plans during the final phase of the theft, but it also provided documentation of her attempts to isolate Dad from anyone who might question her activities. "She just gave us everything we need," Marcus explained as he reviewed the restraining order paperwork. "By claiming that you and Derek are threats to her safety, she's essentially admitting that you've been investigating her activities and that she has something to hide. No innocent person would go to such lengths to keep family members away from someone they claim to love." The restraining orders had backfired spectacularly, providing evidence of consciousness of guilt while failing to actually prevent us from continuing our investigation. With all the pieces falling into place, I made the decision that would change everything. If Brenda wanted me out of Dad's life permanently, I would give her exactly what she thought she wanted. But first, I would make sure that her victory came at a price she hadn't anticipated, and that Dad would finally see the truth about the woman who'd been systematically destroying his life while pretending to love him. The plan came to me during a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling of my beautiful house, listening to Noah breathe peacefully beside me while my mind raced through possibilities and consequences. Brenda wanted me gone from Dad's life permanently, and she'd made it clear that any attempt to expose her would be dismissed as jealousy and manipulation. Fine. I would disappear completely, but not before making sure that Dad had everything he needed to protect himself once he was ready to see the truth. I started by listing my house with a high-end realtor who specialized in quick sales for clients who needed to relocate immediately for work or family emergencies. The $950,000 price tag reflected not just the property value but also all the improvements Noah and I had made during our 3 years there. The kitchen renovation alone had cost $60,000, and every room showcased the kind of attention to detail that came from building a home rather than just buying a house. "Are you sure about this?" the realtor asked as we signed the listing agreement in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of the life I was about to abandon. "The market is strong right now, but selling this quickly means you might not get full value for all the custom work you've done." I assured her that price wasn't my primary concern and that I needed the sale completed within 2 weeks regardless of any financial losses. Simultaneously, I began liquidating all my local investments and transferring assets to accounts that couldn't be traced back to my current location. Jennifer had taught me years earlier that true wealth wasn't about owning things, it was about having options, and I was about to exercise the ultimate option of complete geographical and financial mobility. My consulting business could be run from anywhere with internet access, and most of my clients communicated with me virtually anyway. Derek's increasingly desperate phone calls provided updates on the deteriorating situation at Dad's house. The loan sharks had escalated their collection efforts to the point where they were making daily visits, sometimes bringing friends who made their intentions clear through body language rather than explicit threats. Brenda used each incident to further convince Dad that Derek was a dangerous liability who needed to be completely cut off from the family. "She's got him signing papers almost every day now," Derek reported during one of our covert meetings at a coffee shop across town. "Financial documents, insurance changes, even updates to his will. Every time I try to ask him what he's signing, she says it's none of my business and reminds him that I'm not legally allowed to be in the house anymore." The systematic transfer of Dad's assets was accelerating, and we both knew that time was running out to prevent complete financial devastation. The house sold in 6 days to a young couple who fell in love with the kitchen and didn't mind paying premium price for immediate occupancy. I signed the papers in my realtor's office on a Friday morning, accepting a cashier's check that represented everything Noah and I had built together. That afternoon, I called him at work and told him it was time to execute the relocation plan we'd discussed but never thought we'd actually implement. "You're really doing this," Noah said when he found me packing our belongings that evening. It wasn't a question but a statement of acceptance from someone who understood that some decisions couldn't be negotiated or delayed. "I just want to make sure you're not going to regret leaving before trying to fight for your relationship with your father one more time." I appreciated his concern, but I'd moved beyond hoping for reconciliation with someone who'd chosen a con artist over his own daughter. My resignation letter to my consulting clients was masterfully crafted to sound like an exciting opportunity rather than an emergency evacuation. I explained that I'd accepted a position with a firm that specialized in international business development, which would require relocating to the Pacific Northwest and transitioning my current client relationships to carefully selected colleagues. Most clients accepted the transition gracefully, and several asked for my new contact information so they could potentially work with me in the future. The most difficult conversation was with Derek, who'd been counting on my presence to help navigate the crisis with Dad and deal with his own mounting problems. "You can't just leave," he protested when I told him about the house sale and my plans to relocate immediately. "What am I supposed to do about Dad? What am I supposed to do about the people who want to break my legs if I don't pay them back?" For the first time in our adult relationship, Derek was genuinely asking for help rather than demanding it. "I'm leaving you something more valuable than money," I told him as I handed over a thick envelope containing copies of all the evidence Marcus had gathered about Brenda's criminal background. "This is everything we've discovered about her history, her methods, and her current activities. When Dad is ready to see the truth, give this to him. When he realizes what she's done to him, he'll need someone who can help him rebuild his life." Derek stared at the envelope like it contained either salvation or destruction, which it probably did. The envelope also contained detailed instructions for contacting Marcus Thompson, Jennifer Walsh, and a lawyer who specialized in financial elder abuse cases. I'd prepaid for 6 months of Marcus's investigative services and Jennifer had agreed to provide Derek with business mentoring if he was serious about changing his life. The lawyer would work pro bono if Derek could provide the evidence needed to build a case against Brenda. Everything Dad would need to protect himself was available, but he'd have to choose to use it. "What about us?" Derek asked as I prepared to leave our hometown forever. "Are you just writing off your entire family?" It was a fair question from someone who was finally beginning to understand the consequences of years of taking me for granted. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw someone who was genuinely trying to change but had waited until crisis forced growth upon him. "I forgave Dad the moment I decided to leave," I told Derek honestly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to keep subjecting myself to people who don't value my presence in their lives. If you want a relationship with me, you'll have to prove that it matters to you more than just during emergencies." Derek nodded with something that looked like understanding, and I thought maybe someday we might actually have the sibling relationship that had eluded us for 33 years. Noah and I left town on a Sunday morning in May, driving toward Seattle with everything we owned packed into a moving truck and our cars. I'd bought a cabin in the mountains outside the city, a place where we could rebuild our lives surrounded by natural beauty instead of family drama. As we crossed the state line, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally stopped carrying the weight of other people's expectations and disappointments. Dad discovered that I'd sold my house and disappeared when his neighbor mentioned seeing the moving trucks. Derek told me later that Dad had seemed genuinely shocked that I would leave without saying goodbye, as if he'd expected me to remain perpetually available despite everything that had happened between us. Brenda's reaction was apparently pure relief, since my departure removed the last potential obstacle to completing her theft and disappearing with his money. But I hadn't disappeared without leaving one final message. The letter I'd written to Dad was sitting in Derek's possession, sealed and ready to be delivered when the time was right. It contained everything I'd never been able to say about our relationship, everything I'd learned about forgiveness and self-worth, and everything he would need to understand about why I'd chosen to leave rather than continue fighting for a place in a family that had never made room for me. 6 months after Noah and I settled into our mountain cabin outside Seattle, my new consulting business was thriving in ways I'd never imagined possible. The combination of my reputation for delivering results and the novelty of working with someone who operated from a retreat in the Cascades had attracted clients from across the country who were willing to pay premium rates for my strategic insights. I was earning more money than ever while working fewer hours and feeling genuinely peaceful for the first time in my adult life. The cabin itself was everything I'd dreamed of but never thought I could actually have. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased views of snow-capped peaks and evergreen forests that stretched to the horizon. The kitchen overlooked a garden where I grew vegetables that actually tasted like food rather than the flavorless produce from grocery stores. Noah's architecture firm had opened a satellite office in Seattle, and he'd designed additions to the cabin that maximized both privacy and our connection to the natural surroundings that had become our sanctuary. Our life together had deepened in ways that surprised both of us. Without the constant stress of family drama and professional pressure, we'd discovered aspects of each other that had been hidden beneath layers of ambition and defensiveness. Noah revealed his talent for woodworking by building furniture that perfectly complemented the cabin's rustic elegance. I learned that I actually enjoyed cooking when it wasn't just fuel for the next business meeting but a way to create comfort and connection. Derek's call came on a Tuesday morning in November while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office. His voice sounded different than I'd heard it in years, calmer somehow and definitely more mature. "Brenda's been arrested," he said without preamble, understanding that I'd want the essential information immediately rather than building up to the revelation. "The FBI got her at the airport in Miami while she was trying to board a flight to Costa Rica with $600,000 in various accounts." The story came out in pieces as Derek explained what had happened after I left. Brenda had successfully completed the sale of Dad's house and transferred most of his liquid assets to offshore accounts, just as we'd predicted she would. But her confidence in her methods had made her careless about covering her tracks, and Marcus's evidence had provided exactly what law enforcement needed to freeze her accounts and issue warrants for her arrest. "Dad lost the house and most of his savings," Derek continued, his voice heavy with regret and something that might have been genuine remorse. "But the FBI recovered about $400,000 from accounts she hadn't emptied yet, so he's not completely broke. More importantly, he finally sees what she was doing to him. He kept asking where you were, saying he needed to apologize for not believing you when you tried to warn him." The marriage had been annulled when evidence emerged that Brenda had never legally divorced her second husband in Michigan, making her marriage to Dad invalid from the beginning. Dad was living in a small apartment across town, slowly rebuilding his life with Derek's help and coming to terms with how completely he'd been manipulated by someone who'd appeared to offer salvation during his darkest period. "He wants to talk to you," Derek said quietly. "I know you don't owe him anything after everything that happened, but he's different now. Losing everything made him realize what actually mattered, and he knows he drove away the people who really loved him." Derek had found steady employment managing inventory for a logistics company and was slowly paying off his gambling debts through legitimate work rather than schemes and shortcuts. 2 weeks later, I received a letter forwarded through Derek's address, written in Dad's careful handwriting on stationery that looked like it had come from a dollar store. The contents were everything I'd wanted to hear for 33 years and nothing I needed anymore. He apologized for calling me a burden, acknowledged that I'd been the strong one in our family all along, and admitted that losing everything had taught him the difference between people who wanted to use him and people who actually cared about his well-being. "I called you a burden when you were actually my strength," he wrote in shaky letters that revealed his emotional state. I lost everything because I lost you, and I understand now that money and houses can be replaced but daughters can't. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect you to come back, but I needed you to know that I finally see who you really are and what I threw away when I chose a stranger over my own family. The letter moved me more than I'd expected it would, proving that some part of me had never stopped hoping for his recognition and approval despite all the evidence that it would never come. But it also confirmed that I'd made the right decision in leaving rather than continuing to fight for a relationship that could only exist on his terms. He was offering everything I'd once desperately wanted, but I'd grown beyond needing his validation to feel valuable. I agreed to a video call with Dad on a Sunday afternoon in December, setting up my laptop in the cabin's main room where the mountain views provided a backdrop that spoke to the life I'd built for myself. He looked older and smaller than I remembered, wearing a simple sweater that looked like it had come from a thrift store rather than the expensive clothing Brenda had chosen for him. His eyes were clearer though, as if losing everything had restored his ability to see what actually mattered. "Haley, I can't tell you how sorry I am," he began, his voice breaking with emotion I'd never heard from him before. "You tried to save me from making the biggest mistake of my life, and I called you terrible names and drove you away. I lost my house, my money, and my dignity, but the worst part is knowing that I lost my daughter's respect through my own cruelty and stupidity." Tears ran down his face as he spoke words I'd waited 3 decades to hear. "I forgave you when I left," I told him honestly, surprised by how calm I felt while delivering such important information. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm willing to put myself back in a position where you can hurt me again. I built a life here that makes me happy, and I'm not going to risk that for anyone, even family." The conversation lasted 2 hours, covering everything from Mom's death to my current success to his plans for rebuilding his life with the resources he had left. We established boundaries that felt sustainable for both of us. Holiday cards, occasional phone calls, and the understanding that I would always care about his welfare but would never again sacrifice my peace for his approval. Derek was handling the local logistics of Dad's recovery, and I was providing emotional support from a safe distance that protected the life I'd created for myself. The final call of action came 6 months later when Derek announced that he'd been promoted to assistant manager and had saved enough money to move into his own apartment. Dad had found part-time work at a hardware store and was slowly learning to live within his reduced circumstances without bitterness or self-pity. Both men seemed to have learned valuable lessons about the difference between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. As I sat in my garden on a warm summer evening, watching Noah build a gazebo where we could eat dinner while enjoying the mountain views, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since the day Dad called me a burden. Losing his approval had forced me to find my own worth, and leaving his orbit had allowed me to discover who I could become when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love from people who'd already decided I wasn't valuable enough to receive it. The pain of family rejection had transformed into the strength of self-reliance, and the loneliness of being misunderstood had evolved into the peace of being authentically known by people who chose to love me exactly as I was. Sometimes disappearing really is the only way to reappear as who you're truly meant to be, and sometimes the family you create matters more than the family you were born into. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in impossible situations. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who can't see your value. I hope you find the courage to choose yourself when life demands that kind of difficult decision.